Blind Willie McTell is not from Macon, but he comes through Macon, and there are lots of stories about him performing a street performance, busking, as we would say today. So you have a blues musician, right? So there's a form that is also coming that Miller has some component to, not the way that we're going to talk about it later. But you also talk about soul music, right? So soul is a vocalization that also has this blues piece attached to it. And so we've talked about race music as it's constructed monetarily, right?
Yeah.
Hillbilly music also has its own form, and it's sold in a particular kind of way. Yeah. They all seem to be pulling in a direction parallel to one another.
That's right.
You call it proto-billy, right?
Yeah.
How does all of that work sort of show up in places like Blind Willie McTell? Like, it may not be there, but I'm curious if it is, or more importantly, how is he signaling to something that's coming later that is going to show up in perhaps a place like Otis Redding or James Brown?
Well, one of the ways that I can talk about that is the venues. Now, Emmett Miller, he performed in theaters. And so you would go on the Keith Orpheum circuit, and you would perform all over the country in these specific theaters that catered to a certain clientele, certain booking agents, and they went all over. And as I mentioned before, Emmett Miller was influenced by the black vaudeville circuit of the 1880s and 1890s, and that was its own series of theaters. Like the Douglas Theater is a part of a much larger theater circuit. So you have to imagine first it's theaters, but then when you start to have some of the economic downturns of the 1880s and 1890s, those theaters, many of them shut down. Many of them could not accommodate all the musicians who were coming into the vaudeville circuit at that time. So then they regionalized and traveled out. And eventually they became medicine shows. Now, medicine shows are more of a folkloric version of theater. They have their links back in England and traveling circuses and shows that, again, in Shakespeare, they talk about these traveling shows. So you have to imagine by I guess around the World War I era, this is before the FDA began to approve everything.
Right.
You had people at times that would be unhealthy or sick. So you had a doctor who would come from out of town and he would sell you an elixir. Again, many times it was like booze with some Coca-Cola in it or whatever. Right. But other times it was a way for people to have homemade remedies that were somewhat commodified and made into a commercial type of product. So each of these medicine shows had a doctor, and then they had a musician who was a part of the medicine show, and they might have something else. They might have a Native American chief who was like the like when we see health commercials now, the guy with the white jacket's a doctor. You know, the Native American chief used to mean that. The Native American chief approves such and such an elixir, because and then they sometimes they were selling the truth. Other times they were just selling you a bunch of hooey about the authenticity of said product. But through that, a lot of rural communities then were being trained to go to tent shows with these medicine shows. This is where it links to the Chitlin circuit. So they're not related per se, but the entertainers of the time began to see that secondary towns and sort of third-level towns outside of the major urban centers of the South were, ripe for audiences that were just starved for any type of entertainment. I've spoken with blues singer Bobby Rush, the king of the Chitlin circuit, about this many times. Because these were such small communities, they could, you could go out, Macon's kind of a bigger town, but if you go to, again, like Kathleen, or if you go like to Villarica, or some of these smaller towns, you can find a lot of people who will go out and they will pay their little nickel or their little quarter or whatnot to go into a big tent show. And by the time you get to the 1920s, this is where people like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith are making their way. And then, of course, the Chitlin circuit grows in the 1940s in a different form. That's when you have, like, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Little Richard. There are shows like the Rabbit's Foot Minstrels, Silas Green from New Orleans, and a couple of other shows that are sort of the breeding ground for all these different types of entertainers that eventually, when they get into the commercial industry, they then market them as blues or country or R&B and then rock and roll later on, or soul music. And, so these venues evolving and changing is a big part of how Emmett Miller is connected, because he's part of this older tradition that eventually evolved into a wide open, mobile, traveling art form. I'll say it that way, because it's all of the shows did something a little bit different, and they were somewhat built on the P.T. Barnum circus style. So they also are kind of like, they're bombastic, they're coming up with interesting ways to advertise. A lot of the acts, like the Rabbit's Foot Minstrel, the fellow who started it, he was a eccentric dancer who danced on roller skates, and because roller skates were kind of new, it started a trend around roller skates. So you have to imagine, it's like the memes we have on the internet now. Like, some of it is just for shock value, and that's also a thing with blackface minstrelsy. It's meant to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he said that. And that's what distracts you, and then what brings you in at the same time, because it's everybody can relate to sort of an odd joke, and sometimes the shock value can bring on the popularity just in of itself. So that's kind of one of the ways that Emmett Miller fits within this bigger scope.